The tears streamed down his face without warning. The young German soldier clutched the repatriation documents. His hands shook as he read his name on the transport list. This moment would haunt American minds for decades. Enemy prisoners refusing freedom. Captives begging to remain captives. Warriors who had fought America now pleading to stay in America. The scene repeated itself across the nation. Texas camps witnessed the same drama. Nebraska facilities heard identical pleas. California compounds saw grown men weep at the prospect of going home. These weren't isolated cases of battle fatigue. This was something unprecedented in military history. Thousands of German soldiers had discovered something in American prison camps that they feared losing forever. But their journey to this emotional crossroads began years earlier, back when America faced an impossible mathematical problem. Too many enemy prisoners flooding in. Too few American workers staying home. The solution seemed almost absurd in its simplicity. Ship enemy soldiers across the ocean. Put them to work in American fields. Let them feed the nation while American boys fought overseas. Nobody predicted what would happen next. Nobody anticipated the transformation that awaited both sides of the barbed wire. The crossing itself shocked the German prisoners. They had braced themselves for cattle cars. They found passenger accommodations instead. They expected stale bread and water. Hot meals appeared 3 times daily. These Africa Corps veterans had served under Rommel himself. Desert warfare had hardened them. North African campaigns had tested their resolve. Yet nothing prepared them for their first glimpse of American abundance. Through train windows they witnessed a miracle. Cities untouched by bombing. Factories running at full capacity. Farms heavy with crops that seemed to stretch endlessly toward every horizon. Werner Schmidt pressed his face against the glass. The panzer commander from Hamburg had grown up with rationing. Food shortages had marked his childhood. His family had crowded into cramped apartments while dreaming of better times. Now he watched American farmland roll past in impossible abundance. Cattle grazed in fields larger than entire German towns. Grain silos rose like monuments to prosperity. Small towns displayed wealth that exceeded anything he had imagined. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Germany had been fighting a war it could never win. Not because of courage or tactics or military genius, because of simple mathematics. America possessed resources beyond German comprehension. Other prisoners shared his shock. Franz Mueller had commanded artillery units in the desert. Johann Weber had driven supply trucks across North Africa. Klaus Richter had maintained communications equipment under constant Allied bombardment. All of them understood military logistics. All of them could calculate tonnages and supply lines and industrial capacity. None of them had grasped the true scope of American productive power until they witnessed it firsthand. The camps themselves demolished every expectation. Heated barracks replaced frozen trenches. Regular meals replaced hunger. Medical care replaced neglect. The Geneva Convention governed every aspect of daily life. But even more shocking was the attitude of their captors. American guards treated them like human beings. Camp commanders addressed them with respect. Work supervisors spoke to them as equals rather than slaves. This dignity proved more transformative than any propaganda could have been. These young Germans had grown up under authoritarian rule. They understood harsh discipline and rigid hierarchy. They had never experienced authority exercised with restraint and humanity. Daily routines emphasized this difference. Prisoners could attend religious services of their choice. Educational classes were available in multiple subjects. Recreation programs included sports leagues and cultural activities. Libraries stocked books in German and English. Newspapers kept them informed about world events. Camp canteens sold everything from cigarettes to candy bars to writing materials. Most significantly, they earned wages for their labor. 80 cents per day might seem modest, but it represented something revolutionary to men who had never been paid for military service. They could save money for the future. They could purchase small luxuries. They could begin planning for life after the war. Work assignments followed strict international guidelines. Prisoners could not be forced to support the American war effort directly. But civilian labor fell within acceptable boundaries. American farms desperately needed workers. The countryside beckoned with opportunities. Cotton fields in Texas required harvesting. Wheat crops in Nebraska needed gathering. Timber cutting in Arkansas demanded strong backs. Orchards in California waited for picking crews. Farm families initially approached these arrangements with understandable nervousness. They would be housing enemy soldiers, men who had recently been shooting at American boys overseas. The propaganda images seemed terrifying. Reality proved completely different. Young German prisoners arrived looking more like their own sons than like monsters. They worked hard without supervision. They showed respect for property and animals. They demonstrated gratitude for meals and shelter. The Hoffman family in Kansas hired 6 prisoners for their harvest season. Sarah Hoffman had worried about having enemy soldiers at her dinner table. Within days, she found herself treating them like additional sons. They helped with chores without being asked. They played with her children in the evenings. They shared stories about their own families back in Germany. They showed her photographs of mothers and sweethearts and siblings they missed desperately. Similar scenes played out across rural America. The Henderson Ranch in Texas employed German prisoners for cattle work. The Morrison Farm in Nebraska used prisoner labor for sugar beet cultivation. The Williams Orchard in California relied on German workers for fruit picking. In every case, the same pattern emerged. Initial fear gave way to cautious acceptance. Acceptance blossomed into genuine friendship. Friendship transformed into something approaching family bonds. These relationships challenged fundamental assumptions on both sides. American farmers discovered that enemy soldiers were human beings with hopes and fears and dreams. German prisoners learned that their captors possessed compassion and generosity beyond anything their propaganda had suggested. The conversations that developed during these work assignments proved especially significant. Language barriers gradually dissolved as both sides struggled to communicate. Simple gestures evolved into complex discussions about family and farming and the future. Heinrich Brauer worked on the Thompson farm outside Lincoln, Nebraska. His broken English improved rapidly through daily conversations with Tom Thompson and his teenage son. They discussed agricultural techniques and weather patterns and crop rotation methods. But gradually, their talks turned to deeper subjects. Tom Thompson asked about life in Germany before the war. Heinrich described his family's small farm and his hopes of expanding it someday. Tom shared his own struggles with drought and market prices and the challenges of feeding a growing nation. These exchanges revealed striking similarities between German and American agricultural communities. Both valued hard work and family loyalty and connection to the land. Both faced similar challenges with weather and pests and economic uncertainty. The realization proved profound for men from both cultures. Beneath the uniforms and flags, they discovered shared humanity. The war had created artificial divisions between people who might have been friends under different circumstances. Religious observances provided another bridge between cultures. German prisoners attended services alongside American families. Protestant and Catholic congregations welcomed these young men seeking spiritual comfort far from home. The Reverend William Matthews at First Methodist Church in Concordia, Kansas, began offering services in German for local prisoners. He found them eager for spiritual guidance and hungry for connection with something larger than themselves. These worship experiences proved especially moving for prisoners who had been raised in religious households but had lost touch with their faith during military service. American churches offered not just spiritual comfort, but also community acceptance. Christmas celebrations became particularly meaningful. The winter of 1944 saw something unprecedented in American history. Families across the nation invited enemy soldiers to share their holiday meals. The Jameson family in Iowa set extra places at their Christmas table. German prisoners who had expected to spend the holiday in cold barracks instead found themselves surrounded by warmth and generosity. They sang Christmas carols together. They exchanged small gifts. They shared stories about holiday traditions in their respective homelands. These celebrations created bonds that transcended nationality and politics. Children who had been taught to fear German soldiers instead played games with young men who reminded them of older brothers. Parents who had worried about enemy influences instead found themselves touched by the loneliness of sons separated from their own families. Educational opportunities within the camps accelerated the transformation process. American authorities encouraged prisoners to attend classes in English language and American history and democratic principles. These were not propaganda sessions, but genuine educational experiences designed to prepare prisoners for eventual return to civilian life. The results exceeded all expectations. Men who had received limited education in authoritarian Germany now encountered ideas about individual rights and democratic governance and economic freedom. They participated in discussions that would have been impossible under Nazi rule. Discussion groups formed spontaneously in barracks and recreation halls. Prisoners debated political philosophy late into the night. They grappled with concepts like separation of powers and constitutional rights and the rule of law. For many, this intellectual freedom proved as intoxicating as physical freedom. They had never before been encouraged to think independently or question authority or form their own opinions about complex issues. Klaus Wagner had worked as a mechanic before the war. His formal education ended at age 14 when he began his apprenticeship. In the American camp, he discovered books about engineering and science and mathematics that opened entirely new worlds of possibility. He began imagining a future beyond simple mechanical repair work. Perhaps he could study engineering. Maybe he could design machines rather than simply fixing them. The American emphasis on education and advancement seemed to offer opportunities he had never considered possible. Similar awakenings occurred throughout the prisoner population. Men who had accepted limited horizons in Germany began dreaming of expanded possibilities in America. They witnessed a society that rewarded merit and hard work, regardless of family background or social class. The contrast with their homeland became increasingly stark as letters arrived from Germany. News from home painted pictures of devastation and hardship. Cities lay in ruins under Allied bombing. Food shortages approached starvation levels. The war effort consumed everything while producing nothing for civilian populations. Meanwhile, American abundance continued to astonish the prisoners. Even with wartime rationing, American citizens enjoyed luxuries that seemed miraculous to German eyes. Fresh meat appeared regularly on camp tables. White bread was standard rather than a special treat. Real coffee replaced the grain substitutes they had known at home. But material prosperity alone could not account for the transformation occurring in prisoner attitudes. More significant was their exposure to American values and democratic principles lived out in daily interactions. They witnessed American guards who followed rules rather than arbitrary commands. They worked with American supervisors who treated them as individuals rather than numbers. They encountered American families who extended genuine hospitality without expectation of reward. This consistent pattern of decent treatment gradually dissolved years of propaganda conditioning. The Americans were not the monsters described in Nazi publications. They were people remarkably similar to Germans in their basic humanity. As 1945 dawned and Allied victory became inevitable, the prisoners faced an unexpected emotional crisis. They had assumed throughout their captivity that return to Germany represented their ultimate goal. Liberation would mean reunion with family and friends and familiar surroundings. Instead, many found themselves dreading the prospect of leaving America. The country that had imprisoned them had also liberated them in ways they struggled to articulate. They had discovered possibilities for personal growth and economic advancement and intellectual freedom that seemed impossible in their homeland. The announcement of German surrender in May 1945 should have triggered celebrations in prisoner camps across America. Instead, it created an atmosphere of melancholy and uncertainty. Victory meant the beginning of repatriation. Repatriation meant separation from everything they had learned to value. Lists of names began appearing on camp bulletin boards. Transport schedules were posted. Departure dates were announced. The machinery of prisoner return began operating with typical American efficiency. But efficiency could not address the emotional complexity of the situation. Guards who had worked closely with prisoners for months or years found themselves forming unexpected friendships. Farmers who had relied on prisoner labor discovered they would miss these young men as individuals rather than simply as workers. The prisoners themselves responded with various forms of resistance and denial. Some submitted formal requests to remain in America as immigrants. Others begged their American supervisors to find legal mechanisms for extended stays. Still others simply wept at the prospect of leaving. Friedrich Zimmermann had spent 18 months working on the Rodriguez Ranch in Texas. He had learned to speak fluent English and had mastered American cattle management techniques. His relationship with the Rodriguez family had evolved from employer and employee to something approaching genuine friendship. When his name appeared on the repatriation list, Friedrich approached Senior Rodriguez with a desperate proposal. He would work without wages. He would sign any legal document. He would accept any form of restricted status, if only he could remain in America and eventually bring his family to join him. Senior Rodriguez found himself deeply moved by the request. This young man had become almost like another son. His departure would leave not just a labor shortage, but an emotional void. Yet American military regulations left no room for exceptions. Similar conversations occurred throughout prisoner camps nationwide. Men who had arrived as enemies now begged to remain as friends. Captives who had expected harsh treatment now pleaded to avoid freedom. The irony seemed almost cruel. American authorities understood the human tragedy underlying these requests. Camp commanders who had witnessed prisoner transformations found themselves genuinely reluctant to enforce repatriation orders. But military regulations and international treaties left no alternative. The Geneva Convention required prompt repatriation of prisoners of war following cessation of hostilities. American foreign policy demanded compliance with international agreements. Political considerations made prisoner retention impossible even if legal mechanisms had existed. Yet, the Americans charged with implementing repatriation did so with obvious reluctance and compassion. They arranged farewell celebrations and exchange of addresses and promises to maintain correspondence. They assured prisoners that friendships formed in captivity could continue through letters and eventual visits. The departure process itself was carefully orchestrated to minimize emotional trauma while maintaining necessary security. Prisoners traveled in groups, typically by rail, to East Coast ports. The same Liberty ships that had brought them to America now prepared to carry them back to Europe. But many prisoners would not reach Germany immediately. Severe labor shortages in France and Britain meant that former German prisoners would spend additional months or years working in those countries before finally returning home. This extended delay proved both blessing and curse. It postponed the final separation from everything they had learned to value. But it also prolonged the uncertainty and emotional limbo that made planning for the future nearly impossible. The ocean crossing provided time for reflection and preparation for an uncertain homecoming. Many prisoners spent the voyage writing letters to American friends and recording memories they feared losing and planning for potential return to America under different circumstances. Upon arrival in European ports, former prisoners underwent processing through Allied reception centers designed to screen for war criminals and evaluate fitness for civilian life. For most, this processing was routine, since American camp authorities had already vouched for their character and conduct. But the Germany they encountered bore little resemblance to the homeland they remembered. Allied bombing had reduced major cities to rubble. The economy had collapsed completely. Food shortages approached famine levels in many areas. Most shocking was the political division of their country into occupation zones controlled by former enemies, including the Soviet Union. For prisoners whose homes lay in Soviet-controlled areas, repatriation often meant trading American freedom for communist oppression. East German authorities viewed returning prisoners with suspicion. Their exposure to American ideas made them potential security threats. Many faced intensive political re-education designed to eliminate any democratic sympathies acquired during captivity. The irony proved bitter. Men who had been democratically educated in America now faced communist indoctrination in their homeland. They had learned to question authority and think independently, only to discover that such habits were dangerous in their own country. Yet even under these difficult circumstances, their American experience continued to influence their thinking and behavior. They had witnessed functioning democracy and economic opportunity and individual dignity. These memories could not be easily erased by political pressure. Werner Ostwald returned to Dresden to find his hometown reduced to ruins by Allied bombing. Yet in letters to his former American captors, he wrote with surprising optimism about eventual German recovery and democratic development. The physical buildings can be reconstructed, he told them. What cannot be destroyed is what I learned about human dignity and individual rights. Someday, Germany will need these lessons. When that day comes, I will be ready to share them. The immediate post-war years proved difficult for most repatriated prisoners. Economic challenges were overwhelming in a country whose infrastructure lay in ruins. Social acceptance was complicated by suspicion from Germans who had remained at home during their captivity. But, as West Germany began its remarkable recovery in the 1950s, many former prisoners found themselves uniquely positioned to contribute to reconstruction. Their English language skills proved valuable in dealing with American occupation authorities and business partners. More importantly, their understanding of democratic principles and free market economics helped shape the new Germany that emerged from wartime devastation. They became informal ambassadors of American values, interpreting their homeland to former American friends and interpreting America to fellow Germans. The personal connections formed during captivity did not end with repatriation. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, remarkable correspondence networks flourished between former prisoners and American families who had befriended them. Care packages flowed eastward, carrying food and clothing and small luxuries to help former prisoners survive the difficult Reconstruction years. Letters traveled in both directions, maintaining friendships that transcended political boundaries and cultural differences. As travel restrictions eased and economic conditions improved, former prisoners began making pilgrimages back to America. Some came as tourists eager to revisit places where they had discovered new possibilities for their lives. Others came as immigrants finally achieving dreams harbored during captivity. By the early 1960s, approximately 5,000 former German prisoners of war had emigrated permanently to the United States. This represented only a small fraction of the total who had been held in American camps, but it included many who had been most deeply affected by their wartime experience. They came as engineers and scientists, as businessmen, and farmers as teachers and craftsmen. They brought skills and ambitions, but also profound gratitude for the country that had shown them dignity when they expected harshness. Hans Becker became a successful physician practicing in Georgetown, Maine. In interviews conducted decades after the war, he would repeatedly emphasize the transformative nature of his American experience. "I arrived as an enemy and departed as a friend," he would say. But more than that, I left as a different person. Someone who understood that human dignity transcends nationality, and that freedom represents not luxury, but necessity. The impact of these former prisoners extended far beyond their individual success stories. They became bridges between cultures interpreting America to German audiences and Germany to American friends. During Cold War tensions, these personal connections provided crucial understanding between former enemies turned allies. Most significantly, they became living testimonies to the transformative power of treating enemies with humanity and dignity. Their stories challenged simple narratives about good and evil, friend and foe. They demonstrated that moral principles could be maintained even during total war. The Americans who had known these prisoners were equally transformed by the experience. Farmers who had initially feared enemy soldiers learned that patriotism and human decency were compatible rather than contradictory. Guards discovered that hatred was not required for effective military service. Families who had welcomed former enemies into their homes found that friendship could overcome even the deepest political divisions. Children who had played with German prisoners learned early lessons about shared humanity that transcended artificial boundaries. As decades passed and immediate memories of World War II began fading, the story of German prisoners in America took on new significance. It offered powerful examples of how enemies could become friends, and how captivity could become liberation, and how human dignity could triumph in the darkest circumstances. Today, more than 8 decades after the first German prisoners arrived in American ports, their story remains largely forgotten by the general public. The camps have been dismantled, the barracks demolished, the guard towers removed. Modern infrastructure has replaced these wartime facilities. But for those who lived through this remarkable chapter, the memories remain vivid and meaningful. In small towns across America, elderly residents still remember the German boys who worked their farms and shared their tables. In Germany, children and grandchildren of former prisoners still treasure letters and photographs from American sojourns that changed their families forever. Cemetery markers where German prisoners remain buried stand as silent testimony to men who found final rest far from home. But more meaningful are living testimonies of survivors who carried American experiences back to Germany and used lessons learned in captivity to help build better futures. Their story reminds us that even during humanity's darkest chapters, room remains for dignity and compassion and hope. It demonstrates that values we defend in war must be practiced in peace, and that treatment of enemies ultimately reflects not their character, but our own. Most powerfully, it shows that the phrase "you can return home" need not represent command or threat, but can become invitation to carry the best of one experience into the next. To build bridges across the deepest divides and recognize that home ultimately represents not place, but commitment to principles that make us most fully human. When those German prisoners pleaded, "Please let us stay," they asked for more than geographical residence. They sought to remain part of something larger than themselves. Something that had transformed them from enemies into friends, from captives into free men, from strangers into family. In the end, many did stay, not physically, but spiritually, carrying America with them wherever they went, and sharing its gifts with a world desperately needing healing. Their story proves that unlikely friendships can flourish when nurtured by dignity and respect and recognition of common humanity. The final chapter continues being written in letters still passing between families, separated by oceans, but united by memory. In pilgrimages bringing children and grandchildren back to places where ancestors discovered freedom. In quiet recognition that history's most powerful lessons come not from grand victories, but from small moments of grace.